At my wedding, my wife's dad, a rich CEO, demanded, "Take off those silly medals. Disgraceful." When I refused, he slapped me in front of 280 guests. Then my best man, a four-star Navy SEAL, grabbed his wrist and said 8 words. The whole room stood up. CEO's face went white. So here I am, standing at the altar like some kind of decorated mannequin, watching my bride-to-be Caroline float down the aisle in a dress that probably costs more than my Camaro. And let me tell you something about weddings. They're basically expensive theater where everyone pretends to be happy while secretly judging your choice in music, food, and life partners. But hey, I'm a Navy guy, so I've survived worse productions than this three-ring circus. The chapel is packed tighter than a submarine during a storm drill. We've got 280 guests crammed into pews that were clearly designed by someone who never met an American with a healthy appetite. Half these people I've never seen before in my life, but apparently they're essential to the Hallstrom social ecosystem. Caroline's side looks like a Fortune 500 shareholders meeting. All expensive suits, Botox smiles, and watches that cost more than most people's cars. My side, well, let's just say we brought the actual muscle to this party. Navy guys, Marines, a few Air Force buddies who I keep around for comic relief. You can spot the difference from space. The champagne's flowing like Niagara Falls, and there's enough prime rib to feed a small aircraft carrier. Everything's going according to plan, which in my experience means disaster is about 30 seconds away. I'm standing there in my dress whites, every medal perfectly placed, every crease sharp enough to cut diamonds. These aren't participation trophies we're talking about. These are earned through blood, sweat, and more sand than you'd find at a beach volleyball tournament in hell. That's when Gregory Hallstrom decides to make his grand entrance into my personal space. Now, let me paint you a picture of this guy. Imagine if arrogance had a baby with entitlement, and that baby grew up to be a billionaire CEO who thinks the world revolves around his stock portfolio. Gregory's the kind of guy who probably has his driver honk at pedestrians for existing. He's built an empire from nothing, which I actually respect, but somewhere along the way he forgot that money can't buy you basic human decency, though God knows he's tried. He storms up to me like he owns the place, which technically he does since he's footing the bill for this whole production. His face is redder than a stop sign, and I can practically see the steam coming out of his ears. "Take them off," he hisses at me, pointing at my medals like there's some kind of party favor I picked up at the dollar store. "Take what off?" I ask, even though I know exactly what he's talking about. Sometimes you've got to make people say the stupid thing out loud, so everyone can hear how stupid it sounds. "Those ridiculous medals," he spits. "They're silly. Disgraceful. Disgraceful." Let that sink in for a minute. A guy who's never done anything more dangerous than negotiate a hostile takeover is calling military honors disgraceful. This is coming from someone whose idea of combat is arguing with the country club valet over a scratch on his Tesla. The last time this man broke a sweat was probably when his golf cart ran out of battery on the back nine. I just stand there, calm as a lake before a storm, and give him my best. "Are you kidding me right now? Look. These medals represent service to our country, Gregory. You know, that thing with the flag and the national anthem that you stand for at football games." Wrong answer, apparently. Because that's when Gregory Hallstrom, billionaire CEO, pillar of the business community, and father of the woman I'm about to marry, decides to introduce his palm to my cheek at roughly the speed of sound. The crack echoes through the chapel like a gunshot, and for a split second, everything goes dead silent except for the ringing in my ears. Now, I've been shot at by people who actually knew what they were doing. I've had mortar rounds land close enough to rearrange my dental work. Hell, I've survived Navy food, which should qualify me for hazard pay. So getting slapped by a guy whose most strenuous physical activity is probably opening champagne bottles? That's basically just a surprise high five in the wrong direction. I don't flinch. I don't step back. I don't even blink. I just stand there, feeling the sting spread across my cheek like spilled coffee, and watch as 280 people collectively forget how to breathe. You could hear a pin drop in that chapel, if pins made any noise, which they don't. So basically you could hear absolutely nothing, which was somehow deafening. Gregory's standing there, hand still raised, looking like he just realized he might have made a tactical error. The kind of error that ends careers and starts very uncomfortable conversations with very serious people. His face is cycling through emotions faster than a slot machine. Anger, satisfaction, confusion, and what I'm pretty sure is the dawning realization that he just assaulted a decorated military officer in front of 280 witnesses and probably a few cell phone cameras. That's when my best man, Admiral Marcus Kane, decides to join the party. Now, Marcus is what happens when you take a mountain, teach it strategy, and give it 4 stars and a security clearance. He's calm, controlled, and built like a statue that decided to hit the gym for about 40 years straight. He moves with the kind of precision you only see in people who've made a career out of life and death decisions. Marcus doesn't rush. He doesn't shout. He just reaches out and gently, and I mean gently, takes Gregory's wrist. But there's something in that gentle grip that makes Gregory's face go from red to white faster than a traffic light having an identity crisis. Marcus leans in close, so close that only Gregory, myself, and maybe the front row can hear him, and delivers 8 words that flip the entire power dynamic like Wall Street on a bad Monday. You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer. And suddenly, it's like someone hit the pause button on reality, then slowly, deliberately, hit play again. People start rising from their seats. Not jumping up, not making a scene. Just quietly, respectfully, standing up. First it's my Navy buddies, which is expected. Then the Marines, because they never miss a chance to show solidarity. But then something beautiful happens. Caroline's side starts standing too. Judges, lawyers, business executives, people who probably haven't stood for anything more meaningful than the 7th inning stretch in years. They're all on their feet, and the message is crystal clear. You done messed up, Gregory. The man who could buy and sell small countries with a phone call is standing there, pale as skim milk at a vegan brunch, clutching his wrist and looking around at 280 people who just gave him the silent treatment of a lifetime. And me? I'm still standing there at the altar, medals intact, dignity untouched, watching karma work faster than Amazon Prime delivery. Now, if you're sitting there wondering how the hell I ended up with this delightful specimen of humanity as a father-in-law, well, join the club. We meet every Tuesday at the local VFW, and our motto is, what the hell were we thinking? But seriously, let me walk you through the magical journey of getting to know the Hallstrom family, because it's been about as pleasant as a root canal performed by a blindfolded dentist with anger management issues. Gregory Hallstrom didn't just build an empire from nothing. He constructed a monument to his own ego that's visible from the International Space Station. This guy started with a single electronics store back in the 80s, back when people still thought the internet was something you caught fish with. Through a combination of ruthless business tactics, strategic acquisitions, and what I'm pretty sure was a deal with the devil himself, he turned that little shop into Hallstrom Dynamics, a tech conglomerate that's got its fingers in everything from military contracts to smartphone apps that track how many steps your dog takes. The man wears arrogance like it's a custom-tailored cologne from Paris, and he applies it so thick you can smell his superiority complex before he even enters the room. I'm talking about the kind of arrogance that makes you want to check if gravity still applies to him, or if he's figured out a way to negotiate his way out of basic physics. He's got this habit of walking into rooms like he's expecting a standing ovation, and honestly, sometimes he gets one, because money has this weird way of making people forget their spines at home. Every conversation with Gregory is like playing chess with someone who's convinced they invented the game, wrote the rules, and deserve to win just for showing up. He's got opinions on everything: the weather, the stock market, the proper way to fold a napkin, whether aliens exist, they do, and they're probably his accountants. And he delivers these opinions with the confidence of a man who's never been wrong about anything in his entire life, which is statistically impossible unless you're God. And last I checked, God doesn't drive a Bentley with vanity plates that say Boss 1. But here's the thing about Gregory that really gets under my skin like a splinter made of pure irritation. He thinks money equals wisdom, success equals character, and net worth equals actual worth. In his mind, the fact that he can buy a small island means his opinion on military strategy carries more weight than, oh, I don't know, someone who's actually been in combat. It's like watching someone who's read every book about swimming try to lecture Michael Phelps on proper technique while they're still wearing water wings. At family dinners, which happen with the regularity of a Swiss watch and about as much warmth as a Swiss bank vault, Gregory holds court like he's hosting his own personal TED Talk. These aren't conversations. They're performances where he's both the star and the entire audience. He'll launch into his war stories, and I use that term so loosely it practically falls off the page. We're talking about epic battles like the time he had to fire an incompetent middle manager, or the legendary campaign where he convinced the city council to approve his new office building by taking them all to a steakhouse that cost more per plate than most people spend on groceries in a month. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there like a decorated lawn ornament, fresh from actual deployment, sand still metaphorically in my boots, trying to figure out if this guy thinks combat is what happens when Whole Foods runs out of organic kale and he has to shop at a regular grocery store like some kind of peasant. He'll be going on about how he destroyed the competition in the third quarter, and I'm thinking, buddy, the only thing I've seen you destroy is the English language and my will to live. The man has this incredible ability to turn every conversation into a monologue about his achievements, his wisdom, his superior business acumen. He once spent 45 minutes explaining to me why military discipline is inferior to corporate leadership, apparently unaware that military discipline is what keeps people alive, while corporate leadership is what keeps PowerPoint presentations slightly less boring than watching paint dry in slow motion. But then there's Caroline, and this is where things get really confusing, because she's like finding a diamond in a pile of tax documents. Beautiful, rare, and completely unexpected given the circumstances. Caroline is everything her father isn't: warm where he's cold, funny where he's pompous, and actually human where he's basically a walking quarterly earnings report wearing an expensive suit. She's got this laugh that sounds like Sunshine decided to learn music, and she uses it frequently, especially when I'm being sarcastic about her father, which is pretty much always. Caroline has this amazing ability to see through people's bullshit with X-ray vision, except when it comes to her own family, where she apparently needs prescription glasses. She knows her father is difficult. That's the word she uses, difficult. Like he's a challenging crossword puzzle instead of a human-shaped migraine with a stock portfolio. I sometimes wonder if Caroline was adopted, or maybe switched at birth in some kind of cosmic mix-up where the universe accidentally gave the wrong baby to the wrong family. Maybe somewhere out there is a kind, humble family wondering why their kid grew up to be a ruthless billionaire who thinks empathy is a competitor's weakness. It would explain so much. The first time Caroline brought me home to meet the family, I thought I was walking into a normal house. Sure, it was bigger than the naval base I was stationed at, and yeah, it had more bathrooms than some small towns, but I figured rich people just like options. What I didn't expect was to feel like I was entering a museum dedicated to Gregory's achievements, complete with a gift shop where everything was branded with the Hallstrom logo. The walls were covered with more awards and recognitions than a participation trophy factory explosion. Businessman of the Year, Innovator of the Decade, man who successfully breathed for another year while making money. Okay, I made that last one up, but honestly, it wouldn't have looked out of place. Each award came with a story, and Gregory had memorized all of them like a tour guide who'd been giving the same presentation for 30 years and had never gotten tired of hearing his own voice. Caroline tried to warn me. She said things like, "Daddy can be a little intense, and he's very proud of what he's accomplished, and maybe don't mention that time you saved those hostages in Somalia, because he'll somehow make it about quarterly projections." Okay, she didn't say that last part, but she might as well have. The dinner table was like a battleground where the weapons were words and the casualties were brain cells. Gregory would pepper me with questions designed to prove that my military service was basically an extended summer camp with better workout equipment. He'd ask things like, "But what's your 5-year plan? And how do you see yourself leveraging your military experience in the civilian sector?" As if serving my country was just an elaborate internship program for whatever career he thought I should be pursuing. And through it all, Caroline would sit there, occasionally catching my eye and giving me these little apologetic smiles that said, "I know he's impossible, but he's my impossible, and I love you for putting up with this circus." Those smiles were about the only thing keeping me from explaining to Gregory exactly what I thought of his business philosophy, using vocabulary I'd learned from some very creative sailors who'd spent too much time at sea with limited entertainment options. The breaking point came during one particularly memorable dinner where Gregory spent 20 minutes explaining why soldiers just follow orders, while CEOs make the tough decisions. I finally looked at him and said, "Funny thing, Gregory. I've seen soldiers make split-second decisions that save lives, but the toughest decision I've seen you make is whether to order the lobster or the filet mignon. Caroline nearly choked on her wine, trying not to laugh. Gregory did not find it amusing. That's when I realized we were never going to be buddies. We weren't going to bond over sports, share war stories, or have those touching father-son-in-law moments you see in movies where everyone learns valuable lessons and hugs it out by the credits. No, Gregory and I were destined to coexist in a state of polite mutual annoyance, like two porcupines sharing an elevator. Technically possible, but nobody's going to enjoy the experience. All right, let's dive into the real meat and potatoes of this whole clusterfuck, the medal situation. Because apparently, in Gregory Hallstrom's twisted version of reality, wearing the decorations I earned by literally dodging bullets for my country is somehow more offensive than his habit of wearing socks with sandals to casual dinners. Yeah, you heard that right. This man who lectures people about professionalism thinks Crocs are appropriate footwear for anything other than a mental health evaluation. The whole medal drama didn't just magically appear on my wedding day like some kind of military-themed surprise party nobody asked for. Oh no, this beautiful disaster had been brewing for months, like a perfect storm of stupidity and stubbornness colliding in the most spectacular way possible. It started way back when Caroline first brought me around for family dinner, and I made the apparently catastrophic mistake of showing up in my dress uniform because I'd come straight from a formal military event. Picture this. I walk into the Hallstrom mansion, and I call it a mansion because calling it a house would be like calling the Pacific Ocean a puddle, wearing my navy dress blues with my ribbons and medals properly displayed according to regulations that have been in place since before Gregory figured out how to tie his first Windsor knot. I looked sharp, professional, and proud. Everything a military officer should look like when meeting his girlfriend's family for the first time. Gregory took one look at my uniform, and his face went through more expressions than a method actor having an identity crisis. First, confusion, like he'd never seen a military uniform outside of movies where the military guy usually dies heroically in the second act. Then suspicion, like he thought I might be some kind of elaborate male stripper who'd gotten confused about the dress code. And finally, what I can only describe as barely contained disgust, like I'd just walked into his pristine home wearing a shirt made entirely of participation trophies and liberal arts degrees. "What's with all the colorful stickers?" he asked, pointing at my ribbon rack like I was wearing a kindergarten art project. Colorful stickers. Let that marinate in your brain for a minute. This man reduced decorations for valor, service, and sacrifice to something you'd find on a teacher's desk next to a box of juice boxes and a picture of a cartoon dinosaur saying, "Good job." I tried to keep it light, because Caroline was watching with the kind of nervous energy you usually see in people who are about to witness a car crash but can't look away. "These aren't stickers, Gregory. They're military decorations. Each one represents specific achievements, campaigns, or commendations." He squinted at them like he was trying to read the fine print on a contract written in ancient Sanskrit. "Did you get them from a cereal box? Because they look like something Tony the Tiger would hand out for eating your Frosted Flakes." Now, I've got a pretty good sense of humor about most things. I can laugh at myself, I can take a joke, and I've been roasted by some of the best sailors in the Navy, so my tolerance for creative insults is pretty high. But there's something about reducing years of service, multiple deployments, and actual combat experience to breakfast cereal prizes that really gets under your skin like a rash made of pure disrespect. "Yeah, Gregory," I said, keeping my voice level but letting just enough sarcasm seep through to make my point. "Tony the Tiger personally flew out to Fallujah to pin them on me, right after he rescued me from that burning building and helped me disarm that IED. Hell of a tiger, that Tony." Caroline snorted wine through her nose, trying not to laugh, which was both hilarious and concerning from a medical standpoint. Gregory, however, did not find my little joke amusing. His face went redder than a stop sign in a communist parade, and I could practically see the steam coming out of his ears like some kind of cartoon villain who'd just been outsmarted by a clever mouse. That's when he dropped what he probably thought was some kind of philosophical bomb that would put me in my place and establish the natural order of the universe, where billionaire CEOs reign supreme over everyone else, including people who've actually put their lives on the line for something bigger than quarterly profits. "Soldiers take orders," he said with the confidence of a man who'd never taken an order in his life. unless you count the time his wife told him to take out the trash and he hired a service to do it. CEOs give them. Now, I'll give Gregory credit for one thing. He certainly knows how to deliver a line with conviction. The problem is that conviction without wisdom is just loud stupidity, and loud stupidity is like a fire alarm that goes off when you're making toast. Technically it's working, but it's annoying as hell and makes everyone want to disable it with a baseball bat. That's fascinating, Gregory, I replied, because sometimes the best response to someone's attempt at profundity is to treat it like they've just explained how they discovered fire. I've seen soldiers make split-second decisions that save lives, coordinate complex operations under pressure, and lead teams through situations where failure means people die. But you're right, the only thing you've saved is your parking spot at the country club. Caroline was now making sounds like a tea kettle trying not to explode, and even the house staff, who were usually invisible as professional ghosts, were suddenly finding reasons to dust things very thoroughly in nearby rooms. There's nothing quite like family drama to turn domestic employees into amateur anthropologists studying dysfunctional family dynamics in their natural habitat. That was the moment, the exact second, when I realized that Gregory and I were never going to be best friends. We weren't going to bond over sports, share meaningful conversations about life and service, or have those touching father-son-in-law moments where wisdom is passed down and everyone learns valuable lessons about respect and understanding. No, we were destined to coexist in a state of armed neutrality, like two countries that have agreed not to nuke each other but aren't exactly exchanging Christmas cards either. From that point forward, every family gathering became a carefully orchestrated dance of passive-aggressive comments and barely concealed disdain. Gregory would make snide remarks about playing dress-up whenever I wore my uniform to military events. He'd ask questions like, "Don't you think it's time to grow up and get a real job?" As if serving in the Navy was some kind of extended adolescence where I got paid to play with boats and pretend to be important. Meanwhile, I'd respond with my own brand of military-grade sarcasm, pointing out that my playing dress-up involved actual responsibility, real consequences, and the kind of leadership that doesn't require a boardroom full of yes-men to validate every decision. I'd mention how interesting it was that his idea of combat was a hostile takeover, while mine involved actual hostiles with actual weapons who weren't impressed by his stock portfolio or his collection of business awards. Caroline became a professional mediator, constantly trying to steer conversations away from topics that would inevitably lead to Gregory and me having philosophical debates that resembled verbal jousting matches more than actual discussions. She developed an impressive repertoire of conversational diversions, emergency topic changes, and strategic wine refills designed to keep family dinners from turning into scenes from a military courtroom drama. But Gregory wasn't content to just disagree with my career choice or my uniform. Oh no, that would have been too simple, too straightforward for a man who'd built his empire on the principle that everything could be improved by making it more complicated and expensive. He had to go after the symbols themselves, the ribbons, the medals, the visible representations of service that I wore with legitimate pride. He called them costume jewelry for people who couldn't make it in the real world. He suggested I was overcompensating for something by wearing so many decorations. He even had the audacity to ask if there was a participation trophy included in the collection, apparently unaware that military decorations are the exact opposite of participation trophies. They're earned through specific actions, verified achievements, and documented service that gets reviewed by people who actually understand what those ribbons represent. The breaking point came during a particularly memorable family barbecue where Gregory, emboldened by expensive whiskey and the presence of his golf buddies, decided to hold court about the ridiculousness of military pomp and circumstance. He was going on about how real leaders don't need shiny baubles to prove their worth, apparently forgetting that his office looked like a shrine to every business award he'd ever received, including a crystal paperweight for excellence in quarterly revenue growth that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. That's when I finally had enough of his bullshit and decided to educate this walking LinkedIn profile about what those shiny baubles actually represented. I started pointing to specific ribbons and explaining exactly what actions had earned them, using terminology that made it very clear these weren't handed out for showing up to work on time or successfully completing a PowerPoint presentation without falling asleep. Let me tell you something about wedding planning. It's like negotiating a peace treaty between two countries that speak different languages, worship different gods, and have completely opposite ideas about what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And when one of those countries is run by Gregory Halstrom, you're basically trying to broker peace between a reasonable democracy and a totalitarian regime whose national anthem is the sound of cash registers and whose flag is made entirely of tax write-offs. When Caroline and I first started planning our wedding, we had this adorable, naive idea that it would be a simple, heartfelt ceremony. You know, the kind of wedding normal people have before they realize that simple and Halstrom family event go together about as well as humble and Donald Trump tweet. We wanted something intimate and meaningful, a naval chapel ceremony, close friends and family, maybe a modest reception where people could actually have conversations without needing a bullhorn and a GPS to find each other. Caroline had this beautiful vision of exchanging vows in the same chapel where her grandfather, a Navy veteran himself, had married her grandmother back, when people thought a computer was something that computed your taxes and cars came in any color you wanted as long as it was black. It was going to be perfect, small, personal, and focused on what actually mattered. Two people promising to put up with each other's bullshit until death or irreconcilable differences parted them. But then Gregory found out about our plans, and suddenly our intimate chapel wedding transformed into something that resembled a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a celebration of love. This man approached wedding planning like he was launching a new product line, complete with market research, focus groups, and what I'm pretty sure was a PowerPoint presentation titled Optimizing the Halstrom Brand Through Strategic Matrimonial Events. The chapel, Gregory said when Caroline mentioned our venue choice, his voice dripping with the kind of disdain usually reserved for people who shop at discount stores or drive cars more than 3 years old. Caroline, sweetheart, this is a Halstrom wedding. We don't do small. We don't do modest. We do spectacular. We do memorable. We do events that get written about in society magazines and make other people question their life choices. What Gregory had in mind was less wedding and more three-ring circus with an open bar and a guest list that read like a who's who of people I'd never heard of but apparently should be impressed by. He wanted the Ritz-Carlton, because apparently getting married anywhere that doesn't require a small loan to afford the parking is beneath the Halstrom family dignity. He wanted 3 champagne towers, because 1 champagne tower is for peasants, 2 is for people with modest aspirations, but 3 champagne towers is how you let people know you've truly made it in life. But wait, there's more. Gregory also wanted a fireworks display that would spell out Halstrom in the sky, because nothing says eternal love like temporary explosives arranged to promote your family brand. I'm pretty sure if he could have figured out how to make the fireworks spell out his quarterly earnings, he would have done that too. The man was essentially trying to turn our wedding into a Halstrom Dynamic shareholders meeting with better food and mandatory dancing. It's a wedding, Gregory, not a product launch, I told him during one of our many planning sessions, which were less collaborative discussions and more like negotiations between a hostage taker and someone who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong building. We want something personal, something meaningful, not something that requires air traffic control clearance. Gregory looked at me like I'd just suggested we get married in a McDonald's bathroom while wearing Halloween costumes. Son, he said, and I cringed every time he called me that because it felt like being adopted by a loan shark with delusions of grandeur. This wedding represents the joining of 2 families. The Halstroms don't do small. We do significant. We do events that matter. What matters, I replied, is that Caroline and I love each other. Everything else is just expensive decorating. Wrong answer. Gregory's face went through more color changes than a mood ring having an identity crisis. He started pacing around his office like a caged billionaire, gesticulating wildly at various awards and photos of himself shaking hands with people who were apparently important enough to justify wall space in the Gregory Halstrom Museum of Personal Achievement. You don't understand the significance of this event, he said, his voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining quantum physics to a golden retriever. This isn't just about you and Caroline. This is about establishing your place in society, making the right connections, showing people that the Halstrom name means something. When people look back on this wedding, they should remember it as an event of substance, of importance. When I look back on this wedding, I said, I want to remember marrying the woman I love, not producing a documentary about the socio-economic impact of strategic champagne tower placement. That's when Caroline, bless her diplomatic heart, stepped in with the kind of political skills that would make career diplomats weep with envy. She somehow managed to negotiate a compromise that left everyone equally dissatisfied, which I'm told is the hallmark of successful diplomacy. We'd keep the chapel ceremony, but agree to a larger reception. We'd invite more people, but keep the focus on family and friends rather than business associates, and people whose names Gregory wanted to drop in future conversations. But even with Caroline's masterful mediation skills, Gregory couldn't resist making his position on certain wedding elements crystal clear. During one particularly memorable planning session, he leaned back in his leather chair, the kind of chair that probably cost more than most people's cars and was designed to make whoever sat in it feel like they were holding court over lesser mortals, and delivered what he clearly thought was the ultimate negotiation ender. "You will not embarrass me with that costume," he said, pointing at me like I was a particularly disappointing quarterly report that had failed to meet projected earnings. By costume, he meant my Navy dress uniform, because apparently serving your country is just an elaborate form of cosplay in Gregory's alternate reality, where the only uniform that matters is a $1,000 suit, and the only medals worth wearing are made of gold and purchased from Tiffany. Caroline's response was immediate and beautiful. "Wear what makes you proud," she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand with the kind of support that makes you understand why people write love songs and stupid poetry about finding their person. It was one of those moments where you realize that no matter what happens, no matter how many billionaire father-in-laws try to turn your wedding into their personal ego parade, you've got someone in your corner who gets it. Guess who I listened to? Spoiler alert, it wasn't the guy who thinks bravery is ordering the lobster thermidor instead of playing it safe with the filet mignon. From that point forward, wedding planning became a carefully orchestrated battle of wills disguised as family bonding time. Gregory would suggest additions to the reception that sounded suspiciously like business networking opportunities. I'd counter with requests to keep things focused on the actual wedding part of the wedding. Caroline would smooth things over by finding creative compromises that somehow satisfied everyone while satisfying no one, which is apparently what passes for success in family dynamics. Gregory insisted on upgraded linens because presentation matters. I pointed out that people would be too busy celebrating to analyze thread count. Caroline suggested we split the difference and go with nice but not ridiculous table settings that wouldn't require their own insurance policy. He wanted a live orchestra because a DJ was pedestrian. I suggested that most people under 60 would prefer music they could actually dance to without needing formal ballroom training. Caroline found a band that could do both classical and contemporary, which meant everyone could be disappointed by at least half the musical selections. The cake became another battleground. Gregory wanted something architectural, something that would photograph well for the society pages and serve as a monument to refined taste and unlimited budget. I wanted something that tasted good and wouldn't require engineering degrees to cut without causing a structural collapse. Caroline, showing the wisdom of someone who'd spent her entire life mediating between her father's ego and the rest of human civilization, suggested we get a beautiful cake that also happened to be edible. But through all the negotiations, compromises, and barely contained arguments about the appropriate number of ice sculptures needed for a proper wedding reception, one thing remained constant: Gregory's absolute determination to make sure I understood that my military service, my uniform, and my medals were somehow inappropriate for what he considered a civilized celebration. Every planning meeting included at least one comment about keeping things classy or maintaining appropriate decorum, which were Gregory's diplomatic ways of saying he'd rather I showed up in a rented tux than remind everyone that his future son-in-law had actually done something more meaningful than successfully navigate corporate tax loopholes. The man who had never served anything more demanding than his own self-interest was determined to make sure that my service to my country didn't upstage his service to his stock portfolio. Because in Gregory's world, the only uniform that mattered was the kind you bought from a tailor who charged more per hour than most people made in a week. Let me tell you about Admiral Marcus Kane, my best man, because if you're going to understand how the whole wedding disaster played out, you need to appreciate the kind of backup I had standing behind me. Marcus isn't just any ordinary best man. He's not the guy who's going to fumble the rings, forget his speech, or get drunk and hit on the bridesmaids. No, Marcus is what happens when you take a Navy SEAL, promote him through 4 decades of distinguished service, give him 4 stars, and then teach him the kind of diplomacy that makes foreign ambassadors nervous and enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. Picture this: 6 feet 3 inches of pure military precision wrapped in a dress uniform that looks like it was pressed by angels and tailored by people who understand that perfection isn't just a goal, it's a minimum standard. Marcus has the kind of presence that makes rooms go quiet when he enters, not because he's loud or demanding attention, but because something primal in human DNA recognizes apex predator when it sees one. He's calm as a lake before a storm, controlled as a Swiss watch, and built like a statue that decided to hit the gym for 40 years straight just to see what would happen. When I asked Marcus to be my best man, his response was typically understated. It would be my honor. No big speech, no emotional moment. Just that simple acknowledgement that somehow carried more weight than a dissertation on friendship and military brotherhood. That's Marcus for you. He doesn't waste words, because when you've spent decades in situations where the wrong word can get people killed, you learn to make every syllable count. Now, Marcus and I go back to my early days in the Navy, when I was young, stupid, and convinced that confidence could substitute for experience. He was a lieutenant commander then, already showing the kind of leadership that made you want to follow him into situations that your rational mind knew were probably going to end badly. He had this way of explaining complex operations that made everything sound simple, which is a rare gift when you're dealing with military strategy and the kind of equipment that comes with warnings written in 6 languages and illustrated with pictures of what happens when you screw up. Over the years, I watched Marcus climb the ladder from lieutenant commander to admiral, accumulating stars and responsibilities the way other people collect speeding tickets. But here's the thing about Marcus that separated him from every other high-ranking officer I've ever known. Success never went to his head. Power never corrupted him. The more authority he gained, the more humble he became, which is about as rare in military leadership as unicorns in basic training. Marcus has this incredible ability to assess situations with the kind of clarity that comes from seeing everything twice and surviving it all at least once. He can read people like their instruction manuals written in large print, and he has this uncanny talent for knowing exactly what to say and when to say it to achieve maximum impact with minimum effort. It's like watching a master craftsman work. If the craft involved human psychology and the tools were perfectly timed words delivered with surgical precision. When Gregory started his campaign against my uniform and medals during the wedding planning phase, Marcus became quietly aware of the situation. He didn't offer unsolicited advice, didn't try to solve my problems, didn't give me speeches about standing up for myself. He just made it clear, in that subtle way that career military officers have mastered, that he was paying attention and that he had my back if things escalated beyond normal family dysfunction. Interesting father-in-law, he said one day when we were having coffee at a diner that served breakfast all day and minded its own business. That was it. 2 words that somehow conveyed that he'd sized up Gregory Hallstrom, found him wanting, and filed him away under civilian who needs to learn some manners. I told him about Gregory's attitude toward military service, his comments about medals being costume jewelry, and his general belief that business success trumped military achievement. Marcus listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like you were briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on matters of national security, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When I finished my rant about Gregory's latest insult to military tradition, Marcus was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee with the methodical precision he applied to everything else. Finally, he looked up and said, "Some people confuse net worth with actual worth. It's a common civilian mistake." That was classic Marcus, distilling complex interpersonal conflict into a single observation that cut straight to the heart of the matter. He didn't need to elaborate, didn't need to explain the difference between earning respect through service and buying it through success. He just stated the facts and let them speak for themselves. During one particularly tense rehearsal dinner, when Gregory was holding court about the superiority of business leadership over military command, Marcus sat there like a monument to professional restraint. He didn't argue, didn't contradict, didn't even change expression. He just listened with the kind of attention that made Gregory increasingly uncomfortable as he realized his audience wasn't buying what he was selling. Gregory, emboldened by what he mistook for passive acceptance, decided to get more specific in his criticism of military culture. He started talking about how soldiers were just following orders, while business leaders made real decisions with real consequences. That's when Marcus finally spoke up, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone else at the table shut up and pay attention. "Mr. Hallstrom," he said, and somehow managed to make those two words sound both respectful and subtly threatening. "I've been in situations where the wrong decision gets people killed. Have you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and suddenly Gregory's confident lecture about leadership hierarchy didn't seem quite so impressive. Marcus didn't wait for an answer, didn't push the point, just returned to his dinner with the satisfied air of someone who'd made his position perfectly clear without having to raise his voice or make any overt threats. That was the moment I realized that having Marcus as my best man was like having Godzilla on speed dial. He might look calm and professional on the surface, but underneath that diplomatic exterior was the kind of controlled power that could level city blocks if properly motivated. The man had spent decades in situations where diplomacy was backed by the implicit understanding that other options were available if negotiations failed. Gregory apparently realized this too, because from that point forward, his criticisms of military service became noticeably less direct when Marcus was in the room. It's amazing how quickly civilian arrogance evaporates when faced with someone who's actually had to make life and death decisions under pressure, especially someone who's been trusted with the kind of authority that comes with 4 stars and a security clearance. But Marcus wasn't just intimidating in a theoretical sense. The man had presence that went beyond rank or reputation. He moved with the kind of controlled precision that suggested violence was always an option, even if it was currently filed under diplomatic solutions pending. Watching him navigate social situations was like watching a master chess player who could see 12 moves ahead and was just waiting for opponents to make the predictable mistakes that would end the game. During the rehearsal, when Gregory made his first direct attempt to get me to remove my medals, Marcus stepped closer without seeming to move at all. One moment he was standing casually nearby, the next he was positioned where he could intervene if necessary. It was so smooth, so natural, that most people didn't even notice the tactical repositioning. But Gregory noticed. Bullies always notice when someone who actually knows how to handle themselves takes an interest in the proceedings. "Relax," Marcus said to me quietly, his voice carrying just enough humor to let me know he was enjoying the show. "If he acts up, I'll use him as the cake topper." I thought he was joking. With Marcus, you never really know. The guy once stared down a malfunctioning vending machine for 10 minutes until it gave him his chips out of what I swear was pure intimidation. He has this way of making inanimate objects cooperate through sheer force of personality, which is either impressive or terrifying, depending on your perspective. The morning of the wedding, Marcus showed up at my hotel room with the kind of punctuality that made atomic clocks look sloppy. He was already in full dress uniform, every detail perfect, every decoration precisely placed, looking like he'd stepped off a recruiting poster for people who wanted to serve their country with style and distinction. "Ready for this?" he asked, which was his way of checking if I needed any last-minute moral support or tactical advice. "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied, which was my way of saying I had no idea what Gregory might try, but I was prepared for anything short of actual combat. Marcus nodded and settled into a chair with his coffee, radiating the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of successfully handling situations where failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was fatal. Having him there was like having a security blanket that happened to outrank most of the Pentagon and could probably bench press a small aircraft. The morning of my wedding started like most mornings that are destined to become legendary disasters, with absolutely no indication that I was about to witness a masterclass in family dysfunction that would make reality TV producers weep with envy. I woke up in a hotel room that cost more per night than most people spend on groceries in a month, courtesy of Gregory's insistence that the groom's party stay somewhere appropriate to the Hallstrom family standards. Translation: somewhere expensive enough to make normal people check their bank accounts twice before ordering room service. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was getting ready for my wedding in a room that probably had thread counts higher than the GDP of small nations, while across town, Caroline was likely surrounded by enough bridesmaids, makeup artists, and wedding coordinators to staff a small military operation. The Hallstrom approach to wedding preparation was less getting ready for a ceremony, and more launching a full-scale social campaign with multiple moving parts and enough logistics to make Pentagon planners take notes. My groomsmen had started filtering into the hotel suite around 8 in the morning, which in military time is practically sleeping in, but in wedding time apparently qualifies as crack of dawn preparation. These guys were a collection of my closest military buddies, each one representing a different branch of the armed services and a different level of tolerance for civilian wedding traditions that made absolutely no sense from a tactical standpoint. There was Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison from the Coast Guard, who kept making jokes about how this wedding had more moving parts than a maritime rescue operation and probably twice as many opportunities for something to go catastrophically wrong. Jake had the kind of dark humor that comes from spending your career pulling people out of situations they should never have gotten into in the first place, and he applied that same philosophical approach to weddings. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez from the Marines was handling the logistics of getting everyone ready with the kind of military precision that made civilian wedding planners look like amateur hour. Mike approached getting dressed for a wedding the same way he approached everything else, with a checklist, a timeline, and backup plans for when the original timeline inevitably got blown to hell by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Then there was Captain Tom Bradley from the Air Force, who was providing running commentary on the entire process with the kind of strategic analysis usually reserved for complex aerial maneuvers. Tom had this amazing ability to find the tactical flaws in any plan, which made him invaluable in combat situations and absolutely insufferable at social events where people were just trying to have a good time without conducting a full risk assessment. And finally, there was Chief Petty Officer Danny Sullivan from the Navy, who was serving as our unofficial morale officer and official keeper of emergency supplies. Danny had packed what he called his wedding survival kit, which included everything from backup cufflinks to industrial-strength antacids, because in his experience, any event involving this many civilians was bound to require chemical assistance to get through without permanent psychological damage. The morning was proceeding with the kind of organized chaos that military people excel at. Everyone had their assigned tasks, everyone knew the timeline, and everyone was prepared to adapt when reality inevitably failed to cooperate with our carefully laid plans. We were like a well-oiled machine designed specifically for the purpose of getting one guy properly dressed and emotionally prepared to promise his life to someone in front of 280 witnesses and at least 3 professional photographers. That's when the first crisis of the day struck with the subtlety of a freight train derailing in a fireworks factory. Jake, who was supposed to be our resident expert on all things involving proper footwear for formal occasions, discovered that he had somehow managed to pack everything needed for a wedding except for the one item that would actually go on his feet. His dress shoes were missing, presumably still sitting in his apartment 3 states away, mocking him from a distance. "How the hell do you forget shoes?" Mike asked, applying the kind of logical analysis that made perfect sense in military situations but completely missed the point in civilian emergencies. "The same way you forget parachutes," Jake replied with the kind of fatalistic humor that comes from realizing you've made a mistake that can't be fixed with proper planning or superior firepower. You assume they're there until you need them, and then you discover that assumptions are just disappointment waiting to happen. This launched a full-scale problem-solving session that would have made crisis management consultants proud. Tom immediately started calculating the logistics of emergency shoe procurement, factoring in available time, nearby stores, and the probability that anything purchased on wedding morning would actually fit properly. Danny began inventorying backup options, including the possibility of borrowing shoes from hotel staff or other wedding guests who might have similar foot dimensions. Meanwhile, I was trying to get dressed in my navy dress whites, which is normally a straightforward process that I could do in my sleep after years of practice. But wedding morning has this amazing ability to turn routine tasks into complex engineering challenges. Buttons that normally cooperate perfectly decided to become uncooperative. Ribbons that usually lined up with mathematical precision suddenly developed artistic aspirations and refused to maintain proper alignment. Marcus sat in the corner, already impeccably dressed and looking like he'd stepped off a recruitment poster, sipping coffee with the kind of serene calm that comes from decades of watching younger officers panic over relatively minor problems. He was providing moral support through his mere presence, which was somehow more reassuring than any pep talk or tactical advice could have been. "You know," he said, watching our shoe crisis management team develop increasingly complex solutions to what was essentially a simple problem. "In my experience, most wedding disasters are memorable for about 10 minutes and then become funny stories. The actual marriage is what matters, and that doesn't require perfect footwear." This was Marcus at his finest, cutting through the chaos with the kind of perspective that only comes from surviving actual disasters where lives were at stake. He had this amazing ability to make you realize that civilian problems, no matter how stressful they seemed in the moment, were really just minor inconveniences in the grand scheme of things. Jake eventually solved his shoe crisis through a combination of military resourcefulness and civilian ingenuity. He found a hotel employee who happened to wear the same size and was willing to loan his formal shoes in exchange for what Tom described as compensation sufficient to cover the psychological trauma of participating in our organizational breakdown. While we were dealing with the great shoe emergency of wedding morning, Caroline was presumably across town experiencing her own version of bridal preparation chaos. Based on her later description, her morning involved enough hair and makeup professionals to staff a small salon, more champagne than a championship celebration, and at least 6 different crises involving dresses, flowers, and bridesmaid coordination that made our shoe problem look like a minor logistics glitch. The bridesmaids, according to Caroline's post-wedding debriefing, had turned her hotel suite into something resembling a combination beauty salon, therapy session, and amateur documentary filming location. Everyone was taking pictures of everything, offering advice on topics they knew nothing about, and generally creating the kind of controlled chaos that makes wedding coordinators drink heavily and consider career changes. Her maid of honor, Jessica, was apparently handling the morning with the kind of military-grade organization that would have made my groomsmen proud. Jessica had created detailed schedules, assigned specific responsibilities to each bridesmaid, and established backup plans for common wedding morning disasters. She was like a civilian version of a military operations coordinator, except instead of coordinating tactical maneuvers, she was coordinating hair appointments and emergency lipstick touch-ups. Meanwhile, Caroline's other bridesmaids were providing entertainment through a combination of wedding day superstitions, last-minute relationship advice, and the kind of emotional support that involves equal parts encouragement and champagne. They were probably making TikToks, because that's apparently what people do now when they want to document important life events. They create short videos that will be forgotten in approximately 15 minutes, but seem crucial in the moment. Back in my hotel suite, we had moved beyond shoe procurement and into the more serious business of final preparation checks. Mike was conducting what he called a uniform inspection, which involved examining every detail of my dress whites with the kind of attention usually reserved for equipment that might malfunction in combat situations. Every ribbon had to be perfectly aligned, every button properly fastened, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Tom was handling timeline management, coordinating our departure from the hotel with traffic patterns, expected arrival times, and buffer periods built into account for the kind of unexpected delays that seemed to multiply exponentially on wedding days. He had created what looked like a military operations timeline, complete with contingency plans and alternative routes in case our primary transportation plan encountered resistance. Danny was managing morale and supplies, making sure everyone had adequate hydration, appropriate nutrition, and whatever chemical assistance might be required to maintain optimal performance throughout the day. His wedding survival kit had grown to include items that would have been useful in actual survival situations, which made sense given that wedding days often feel like exercises in civilian endurance training. Walking into that chapel was like stepping into a live-action sociology experiment designed to test whether oil and water could coexist in the same space without exploding into a mess that would require professional cleanup crews and possibly therapy for everyone involved. The seating arrangement told the whole story better than any wedding planner's carefully crafted vision statement. We had achieved what military strategists would call a clear division of forces along ideological lines. On the left side, Gregory's people sat like they were attending a board meeting that happened to involve flowers and formal wear. These were the CEOs, the investors, the people who measured success in quarterly earnings and thought hostile takeover was just another Tuesday afternoon activity. They wore their wealth like armor, all expensive suits and jewelry that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Every one of them looked like they could buy and sell small countries before lunch, then go golfing while their accountants figured out the tax implications. The right side, my side, looked like a recruitment poster for people who actually knew what the word service meant when it wasn't followed by charges or fees. Uniforms everywhere: Navy dress blues, Marine dress reds, Army dress greens, Air Force dress blues, and enough ribbons and decorations to make a rainbow jealous. These were people who'd earned their positions through something more substantial than stock portfolios and inheritance planning. They sat with the kind of posture that comes from decades of standing at attention and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from surviving situations where confidence was the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. Talk about your basic cultural divide. On one side, you had people who fought battles in boardrooms and measured victory in profit margins. On the other side, you had people who fought actual battles in actual places where people actually shot back and measured victory in getting everyone home alive. It was like watching two different species of American trying to coexist in their natural habitat, except their natural habitats were about as compatible as fire and gasoline. The chapel itself was beautiful in that understated military way that prioritizes substance over style. Simple wooden pews, stained glass windows that told stories of service and sacrifice, and an altar that had witnessed more promises between people who understood what commitment really meant than most civilian churches see in a decade. This was a place where people came to make vows they intended to keep, not because a prenup required it, but because their word actually meant something. I was standing at the altar, taking in the scene and trying not to think about how this whole thing could go sideways faster than a sports car with a blown tire. Marcus was beside me, radiating that calm confidence that made you believe everything would work out fine, even when all available evidence suggested we were about 30 seconds away from a social disaster that would be talked about in both military circles and business communities for years to come. The processional music started, and I felt that familiar pre-combat tension that comes when you know something significant is about to happen, but you're not entirely sure whether you're going to emerge victorious or just emerge. Caroline's bridesmaids came down the aisle looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine dedicated to people who knew how to walk in high heels without falling over, which is apparently a more complex skill than I'd previously understood. Then came Caroline, and for a moment, everything else faded into background noise. She looked absolutely stunning, floating down the aisle in a dress that managed to be both elegant and timeless without looking like it required an engineering degree to put on. Her smile could have powered the entire chapel, and when our eyes met, I remembered why we were doing this whole elaborate production in the first place. Because sometimes you meet someone who makes you want to promise ridiculous things like forever and actually mean it. But then reality crashed back into the moment like a drunk driver hitting a roadblock. Halfway down the aisle, Gregory rose from his seat with all the dramatic flair of a Broadway actor making his grand entrance. Except this performance was happening in real life and nobody had given him a script that ended well for anyone involved. He stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking like money incarnate, and announced to the entire chapel, 280 people who'd come to witness a wedding, not a public humiliation, his brilliant contribution to our special day. Take off those silly medals. The words hung in the air like tear gas, poisoning the atmosphere and making everyone wish they were somewhere else. Silly medals. He actually used the word silly to describe decorations that represented years of service, multiple deployments, and the kind of sacrifice that people like Gregory couldn't understand because they'd never been asked to risk anything more valuable than their stock options. The chapel went dead silent, except for the sound of 280 people simultaneously realizing they were about to witness something that would either be legendary or tragic, and possibly both. I could feel every eye in the place focused on me, waiting to see how I'd respond to being publicly disrespected by my future father-in-law in front of everyone I cared about and a bunch of people I didn't. I looked at Gregory, standing there with his chest puffed out like a peacock having a territorial dispute, and gave him my best, "You've got to be kidding me" expression. Nope, I said, keeping my voice level and clear so everyone in the chapel could hear my response to his public challenge. One word. Simple, direct, and absolutely final. No explanation, no justification, no elaborate defense of why I had every right to wear the medals I'd earned. Just nope. Delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're absolutely right and the other person is absolutely making an ass of himself in front of everyone. That's when Gregory made the decision that would define the rest of the day and probably haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of accepting my polite refusal and sitting down like a reasonable human being, he decided to escalate the situation in the most spectacular way possible. He slapped me. The sound of his palm connecting with my cheek echoed through that chapel like a gunshot, sharp and unmistakable and absolutely shocking to everyone present. For a split second, the entire universe seemed to pause, like even physics was trying to process what had just happened and figure out how to respond appropriately. Gasps everywhere. Not the kind of gasps you get when the bride trips on her dress or someone drops the rings, but the kind of gasps that come when people witness something so fundamentally wrong that their brains need a moment to catch up with their eyes. I'm talking about full-body gasps, the kind that make people clutch their pearls and immediately start composing the stories they'll tell about this moment for the rest of their lives. Honestly, I was expecting at least one person to start a slow clap, because in movies, moments like this usually come with some kind of dramatic musical score or at least appreciative murmuring from the audience. But real life doesn't come with a soundtrack, and real people were too stunned by the sheer audacity of what they'd just witnessed to provide any kind of commentary, slow-clapped or otherwise. I just stood there, feeling the sting spread across my cheek like spilled coffee, tasting the metallic tang that comes with adrenaline and barely controlled anger. But I didn't move, didn't retaliate, didn't give Gregory the satisfaction of seeing me lose my military composure in front of everyone. I just absorbed the hit and waited to see what would happen next, because in situations like this, the next move usually determines whether things get better or whether they go completely to hell. The silence that followed Marcus's 8 words was the kind of silence that makes you understand why people use phrases like deafening quiet and thunderous stillness. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something much more powerful. It was the sound of 280 people simultaneously realizing they'd just witnessed a moment that would be talked about for years, analyzed in business schools as a case study in spectacularly poor decision-making, and probably turned into a cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets actual authority. You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer. Those 8 words hung in the air like a verdict delivered by a judge who'd seen all the evidence and reached a conclusion that was both inevitable and damning. Marcus didn't shout them, didn't dramatize them, didn't add any theatrical flourishes. He just stated the facts with the kind of calm precision that made them sound like an official military report being filed for the historical record. But here's the thing about facts delivered by 4-star admirals. They carry weight that goes beyond mere words. When Marcus spoke, it wasn't just one person correcting another person's behavior. It was the voice of institutional authority, backed by decades of service and the kind of moral credibility that money can't buy and arrogance can't fake. It was the sound of someone who'd earned the right to speak for every person who'd ever worn a uniform in defense of something bigger than themselves. Gregory stood there, still clutching his wrist where Marcus had grabbed it, looking like a man who'd just realized he'd stepped on a landmine in what he thought was a peaceful meadow. The color drained from his face so fast I half expected to see it pooling at his feet like spilled paint. This was a guy who'd spent his entire adult life being the most important person in any room he entered, and suddenly he was facing the dawning realization that importance based on bank account balances doesn't necessarily translate to importance in the real world. The transformation in Gregory's expression was like watching a time-lapse video of someone aging 20 years in 20 seconds. First came confusion, because I don't think it had ever occurred to him that his actions might have consequences beyond whatever he was willing to pay to make problems disappear. Then came fear, the kind of primal, animal fear that kicks in when you realize you've miscalculated badly and there might not be a way to buy your way out of the mess you've created. But the real magic didn't start with Gregory's face turning the color of day-old oatmeal. The real magic started with the subtle sound of fabric rustling as people began to move. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first drops of rain before a storm that's going to change everything. First, it was my guys. The military side of the chapel began rising to their feet with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from years of training and an instinctive understanding of when solidarity is required. These weren't casual gestures or spontaneous outbursts of emotion. These were deliberate acts of support delivered with military bearing and unshakable conviction. Jake from the Coast Guard stood first, his dress uniform immaculate, his face set in the kind of expression that suggested he was ready to turn this wedding chapel into a courtroom if necessary. Then Mike from the Marines, rising with the kind of fluid motion that suggested violence was always an option, but currently filed under diplomatic solutions pending. Tom from the Air Force joined them, followed by Danny from the Navy. And suddenly the right side of the chapel looked like a formation review where the topic under review was basic human decency. But then something absolutely beautiful happened, something that made me understand why people write poems about moments when ordinary people do extraordinary things. The left side of the chapel, Gregory's people, the business elite, the folks who'd probably never stood for anything more meaningful than the national anthem at sporting events, they started standing too. It began with an older gentleman in the front row, someone who looked like he'd been fighting corporate battles since before Gregory learned to read annual reports. He rose slowly, deliberately, with the kind of dignity that suggested he understood exactly what his action meant and was prepared to live with the consequences. Then the woman next to him stood, followed by the couple behind them. And suddenly Gregory's own people were joining what was becoming the most polite rebellion in wedding history. Judge Patricia Morrison, a federal judge who'd probably seen every kind of human behavior in her courtroom, stood with the kind of authority that made her black dress look like judicial robes. Senator William Hayes, who'd built his political career on understanding which way the wind was blowing and positioning himself accordingly, rose with the practiced grace of someone who knew a losing position when he saw one. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a renowned surgeon who'd probably saved more lives before breakfast than most people save in a lifetime, stood with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the difference between earned respect and purchased influence. Corporate lawyer Jonathan Mills, who'd spent his career defending people like Gregory from the consequences of their actions, rose with what looked like the first genuine expression of moral conviction he'd shown in decades. Even Gregory's golf buddies, the guys who'd probably agreed with every word of his anti-military rants over expensive scotch and cigars, were getting to their feet like they'd suddenly remembered they were Americans first and country club members second. These were people who'd built their entire social identity around agreeing with Gregory Hallstrom, and they were standing up in direct opposition to what he'd just done. The most beautiful part was watching it spread through the chapel like a wave of collective conscience. People who'd never met each other, who came from completely different worlds, who probably disagreed about everything from politics to pizza toppings, were united in this one moment by the simple recognition that some things are more important than money, more valuable than influence, and more sacred than social status. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, Gregory's own sister, rose from her seat with tears in her eyes and the kind of expression that suggested she was finally seeing her brother clearly for the first time in decades. Dr. Robert Kim, Gregory's personal physician, who'd probably been biting his tongue through years of medical advice being ignored in favor of business priorities, stood with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this moment without even knowing it. Caroline's college friends, young professionals who were still figuring out what they believed in and what they were willing to stand for, rose with the enthusiasm of people who'd just witnessed their first real lesson in moral courage. Her sorority sisters, who'd probably never given much thought to military service beyond thanking veterans on appropriate holidays, stood with the kind of awakening that suggested they were seeing something larger than themselves for the first time. The chapel filled with the sound of 280 people standing in solidarity, not applauding, not cheering, not making any kind of celebratory noise, just standing in quiet, dignified support that somehow carried more power than any amount of shouting or protest could have managed. It was like watching democracy work in real time, seeing what happens when people are presented with a clear choice between right and wrong and choose correctly despite social pressure to do otherwise. Gregory stood there in the middle of it all, pale as skim milk at a vegan brunch, clutching his wrist and looking around at what had to be the most expensive education in human decency he'd ever received. Every person in that chapel, his employees, his business partners, his social equals, his own family members, was standing in judgment of his actions, and their verdict was written clearly in their posture. The man who could buy and sell small countries with a phone call was experiencing what it felt like to be morally bankrupt in front of everyone who'd ever mattered to him. His wealth couldn't fix this, his influence couldn't change it, and his arrogance had created a situation that no amount of money could make go away. Marcus released Gregory's wrist with surgical precision, the kind of controlled movement that suggested the grip had been exactly as firm as necessary to make a point without causing permanent damage. Gregory stumbled backward slightly, not from physical force, but from the psychological impact of realizing he'd just made himself the villain in a story that 280 people would remember forever. Even the flower girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and probably didn't understand the complexities of military honor and civilian disrespect, was giving Gregory a look that suggested she instinctively knew he'd done something wrong. Children have this amazing ability to recognize bad behavior even when they can't articulate why it's bad, and this kid was staring at Gregory like he'd just kicked a puppy in front of a room full of people who really liked puppies. The chaplain, bless his professional soul, cleared his throat with the kind of diplomatic authority that comes from years of conducting ceremonies where emotions run high and people occasionally lose their minds in front of God and everybody. He looked around at 280 people standing in silent solidarity, then at Gregory, who was still clutching his wrist like it contained the last shreds of his dignity, and delivered what might have been the most perfectly timed question in wedding history. "Shall we continue?" "Damn right we shall." Those 4 words cut through the tension like a hot knife through butter, reminding everyone that we'd come here for a wedding, not a public shaming, though the fact that we'd gotten both was just a bonus that would make this ceremony memorable for all the right reasons and all the wrong ones simultaneously. Caroline appeared at the back of the chapel like an angel who'd been waiting backstage for her cue to enter the world's most dramatic wedding performance. She walked down that aisle with a smile that suggested she'd just watched karma deliver a masterclass in poetic justice, and honestly, it was one of the most beautiful sights I'd ever seen. Her dress flowed behind her like liquid happiness, and when she reached the altar, she looked at me with eyes that said, "Well, that was entertaining. Now let's get married." The actual ceremony proceeded with surprising normalcy, considering we'd just witnessed what amounted to a social execution carried out with military precision and civilian participation. We exchanged rings, which thankfully nobody dropped despite the emotional roller coaster we'd all just experienced. We recited traditional vows with a few personal additions that somehow felt more meaningful after everything that had just happened. My vows included a promise not to roll my eyes at Caroline's reality TV shows, which got a genuine laugh from the crowd and helped restore some of the joy that Gregory's spectacular meltdown had temporarily stolen from the proceedings. Caroline promised to always support my service, which carried extra weight given the recent demonstration of what lack of support looked like when displayed in front of 280 witnesses. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the kiss that followed felt like victory and vindication wrapped up in the kind of moment that makes you understand why people write love songs and stupid poetry about finding their person. The applause that erupted was enthusiastic enough to make up for all the awkward silence from earlier, and it felt like the entire chapel was celebrating not just our marriage, but the triumph of basic human decency over arrogant wealth. The reception that followed was like attending 2 completely different parties happening in the same space. On one hand, you had genuine celebration, people eating, dancing, laughing, and generally having the kind of good time that makes wedding receptions worth the expense and logistical nightmares they inevitably involve. On the other hand, you had the constant undercurrent of whispered conversations about what everyone had just witnessed. "Did you see the slap?" became the unofficial greeting of the evening, followed immediately by "Did you hear those 8 words?" People were dissecting the incident like military strategists analyzing a successful operation, except instead of studying tactical maneuvers, they were examining the social dynamics of what happens when nouveau riche arrogance meets old-school military honor. The most beautiful part was watching Gregory's absence become more noticeable as the evening progressed. The man who'd insisted on being the center of attention at every family gathering had managed to make himself irrelevant through his own spectacular failure of judgment. Tables that should have been anchored by his presence were having better conversations without him. Business associates who usually competed for his attention were discovering they actually preferred talking to each other. Gregory had vanished before the cake cutting, probably slinking away like a vampire who'd suddenly realized he was allergic to sunlight and human decency. I imagine he went home to punch his reflection in the mirror, though knowing Gregory, he probably blamed the mirror for not making him look better while he was making poor life choices. The cake cutting proceeded without incident, unless you count Marcus's dry observation that the cake has better structural integrity than some people's moral foundations. The band played music that people could actually dance to. The bar stayed busy enough to keep everyone properly hydrated, and the photographer got enough pictures to document what would probably become the most talked about wedding in both military and business circles. Later that night, after most of the guests had departed and the cleanup crews had started their work, Caroline and I slipped outside for some fresh air and a moment of quiet reflection. The evening had exceeded our wildest expectations, though not necessarily in ways we could have predicted during the planning phase. Marcus appeared beside us with the stealth that only comes from decades of military training, raising a glass of champagne in a toast that perfectly captured the surreal nature of our wedding day. "Well," he said with that trademark understated humor, "that's one way to win a room." Caroline touched my cheek where Gregory had slapped me, her fingers gentle against skin that had stopped stinging hours ago. "Does it still hurt?" she asked with the kind of concern that makes you fall in love all over again. "Nah," I told her, because honestly, physical pain from a slap delivered by a man who'd probably never thrown a real punch in his life was nothing compared to the satisfaction of watching 280 people choose integrity over influence. I've had mosquito bites worse than that. Standing outside that reception venue with Caroline's hand in mine and Marcus's toast still hanging in the air like the perfect punctuation mark to the world's most memorable wedding, I realized something profound about revenge. Most people think revenge is about grand gestures, elaborate schemes, and carefully orchestrated payback that takes years to plan and execute. Hollywood has convinced us that true satisfaction comes from complex plots involving multiple moving parts, dramatic confrontations, and preferably some kind of explosion or at least a really good one-liner delivered at the perfect moment. But here's what I learned that night. Watching the lights from the reception hall spill golden warmth across the parking lot, while Caroline laughed at something Marcus had said. Sometimes the best revenge is just being yourself when someone else is trying their absolute hardest to make you into something you're not. Sometimes the most devastating response to cruelty is simply refusing to let it change who you are or compromise what you believe in. Gregory had spent months trying to break me down, chip away at my pride, and convince me that my service meant less than his success. He'd used every weapon in the civilian arsenal: mockery, condescension, financial pressure, and finally physical assault, all designed to make me shrink, apologize, and conform to his vision of what I should be. And his ultimate defeat hadn't come from any elaborate counterattack on my part. It had come from me just standing there, wearing my uniform with pride, and letting 280 people see the difference between earned respect and purchased influence. "You know what the funny part is?" Caroline said, leaning against me with the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from surviving a crisis together and realizing you're stronger as a team than you ever were individually. "Daddy spent all that money on this wedding, invited all these important people, tried to make it this perfect showcase of Hallstrom family prestige, and the only thing anyone's going to remember is how he made a complete ass of himself in front of everyone who matters to him." She was right, and the irony was beautiful in its completeness. Gregory had essentially paid for his own public humiliation, funded the venue where his moral bankruptcy would be displayed for all his peers to witness, and invited the audience that would judge him and find him wanting. It was like watching someone buy a billboard to advertise their own character flaws, except more expensive and with better catering. Marcus finished his champagne and set the glass down on a nearby table with the kind of precision he applied to everything else. "In my experience," he said, "the people who talk the most about respect usually understand it the least. Your father-in-law spent the entire evening learning what respect actually looks like, and it doesn't look anything like what he thought it did." The drive home that night was quiet in the way that comes after surviving something intense together. Caroline had kicked off her wedding shoes and was curled up in the passenger seat, still in her dress, but looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. The stress of managing her father's expectations, our wedding plans, and the inevitable collision between his ego and my principles had been weighing on her more than she'd admitted, and watching it all resolve itself had lifted a burden neither of us had fully acknowledged carrying. "I'm sorry about Daddy," she said as we pulled into our driveway, the porch light casting long shadows across the yard that would soon be filled with wedding presents and thank you cards from people who'd witnessed history in the making. "Don't be," I told her, and I meant it. Today wasn't about him. It was about us, and what we learned about the people in our lives. We found out who our real friends are, who has our backs when things get difficult, and what happens when you stand up for what's right even when it's not easy. The truth was, Gregory's behavior had revealed more about everyone else than it had about him. We'd seen Caroline's college friends choose principle over social convenience. We'd watched her father's business associates prioritize basic human decency over professional relationships. We'd witnessed complete strangers stand up for someone they barely knew because they recognized that some things transcend personal connections and social obligations. 6 months later, we'd hear through the family grapevine that Gregory's reputation in certain social circles had never fully recovered from what people started calling the wedding incident. Apparently, when you publicly assault a decorated military officer at your daughter's wedding, it becomes the kind of story that follows you to country club events, business dinners, and charity galas. People remembered, because moments of moral clarity have this amazing ability to stick in human memory longer than quarterly earnings reports or golf handicaps. But here's the thing about real revenge. It's not about destroying your enemy or making them suffer. Real revenge is about proving that their opinion of you was wrong, their assessment of your character was flawed, and their attempt to diminish you actually revealed their own limitations. Gregory had tried to make me look small, and instead he'd made himself look smaller than anyone had imagined possible. The decorations I wore that day, the ribbons and medals he'd called silly and disgraceful, had become symbols of something larger than individual achievement. They'd become representations of the difference between service and selfishness, between earning respect and demanding it, between standing for something meaningful and standing for nothing more than your own advancement. Years later, when people ask me about that wedding, I don't tell them about Gregory's slap or his public humiliation. I tell them about watching 280 people choose to do the right thing when it would have been easier to do nothing. I tell them about Caroline walking down that aisle with a smile that could have powered the entire chapel. I tell them about Marcus delivering 8 words that changed everything, and about discovering that sometimes the best way to defeat someone who's trying to crush you is simply to refuse to be crushed. Gregory will always be rich. He'll always have his stock portfolio, his expensive cars, his country club membership, and his ability to buy his way out of most problems. Money is a powerful tool, and he's mastered the art of using it to get what he wants from people who need what he has. But me? I'll always be the guy that 280 people stood up for when it mattered. I'll always be the man who wore his service with pride, even when someone tried to shame him for it. I'll always be the officer who stood tall while a billionaire made himself smaller than his bank account balance. And you can't put a price tag on that. Though knowing Gregory, he probably tried.